Deluca. I just edited an issue of the Churchills on this subject, more or less, the 30% non-dead tree issue. Shall we begin with introductions?
Okay, can everyone hear me all right?
No, please speak up.
Okay. My name is Vandana Singh, and I write mostly short stories, and my background is in actually I'm a particle physicist transitioning to climate change science, particularly the teaching and communicating, but also the science. And just in case I sound incoherent in thoughts, I just want to let you know I have a headache, so I apologize.
Good afternoon, my name is Daley. I primarily write for children, science and science fiction. I was a kid, and both my first novel was Space Station Rat, and my newest novel was Racing the Blue Monarch, coming out deal tangentially with the issue of global warming, using this as part of the background of the world that I create. And in my regular life, I was taught renewable energy for many, many years, starting 25 years ago when the world didn't know what solar energy was, or thought it didn't. And we'll probably touch on that. It's a different world today, for sure.
Hi, I'm Gladstone. I write the craft sequence of fantasy novels, or sort of post-industrial fantasy novels dealing with a world where magic is causing a lot of problems that would be very recognizable to people in the 21st century. People who are living in the 21st century are kind of all in. So that's what I do, and I think coming off with a little bit of a background as utilities analyst briefly.
My name is Clare. I have so far stories, and I usually write some stories about climate change as something that's being dealt with. And in real life, I have a PhD in the ecology of fungi.
I'm really excited to find that you all have some more sciencey and concrete background.
Not only in one area, well, analysts do something different.
Yeah. Okay, so let's begin with the Anthropocene, I guess. Should anyone be...
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Could everyone speak up a little bit? Yeah. Or a lot? Yeah, 3 other mics. Actually...
What if I talk into it like this?
How's that? Yes? No? No.
Oh, they're on.
Okay.
How's that work? Okay, so the Anthropocene is this new term for the current epoch of geologic time. The idea is that we are all, there are sufficient numbers of us, and we are acting on the Earth with significance enough to have effects similar to those of volcanoes, tectonic shifts, asteroids, what have you. Am I doing this justice? Would anyone who has a science background like to say a better description? Okay, so the question is, what's happening? Does on the right Anthropocene fiction, and what are we trying to accomplish by doing that?
Of course, on that point, it's the idea that humanity is sufficiently populous on the world to affect the world itself. I've been thinking a lot about this since I taught renewable energy for 25 years before the global warming was a big issue. But as it crept up, it dawns on you, and of course the nuclear issue is the more technological face of the same problem, that if you accept us as animals on the earth with all the other animals, we've been doing what animals do all our existence, and that is filling the environment to the maximum potential that we have. And animals do that until the environment collapses, and then they die back they get cut back by the Earth's processes. And so as humanity, I think we're at that point where, with the global warming, different than nuclear, we've set out a process that is going to trim our species if we don't get a handle on it. And it sort of raises the ultimate issue of, are we animals or are we a little bit different? Because animals don't stop, it just collapses. Are we going to stop before it collapses? And in a way, that's what this fiction would engage, it's what our science is going to engage, is that issue.
Well, basically, John our problem right now. It being June 50th anniversary, one of the core axes in that book, for people who haven't read it, is whether an individual is an animal or a human being. Animals react instinctively to stimuli. Animals are incapable of reasoning and working for the future. And as many of us actually are in our day-to-day lives, right? We react instinctively to stuff. We don't stop. Whereas real humanity in the framework of this book comes with being able to endure, change, and transform.
That's a good one.
Well, excuse me. I think it has to go deeper, though. When I examine, what's happening to the world, when I teach this stuff in the classroom, when I try to write fiction about it, the thing that I'm forced to look at is that, we call this the Anthropocene, and but that obscures something. That obscures the paradigm that is that the world functions underneath. And some people have proposed calling this era the Capitalocene. And so we are talking about not just species doing what species do, but I think that it's also that we have blindly accepted and naturalized and considered natural and normal something that has been imposed on us through whatever cultural shifts and the vagaries of history. It is, after all, if you trace this back, it is if you combine the attributes of extreme individualism, overconsumption, the destruction of the world's resources, so that literally a few people in the world can get super rich and super powerful, then that sheds a different light on the entire situation as well. So I think we should not we should not let the term Anthropocene obscure the politics that's at work here. And having said that, I should also mention that I believe that it's not just capitalism to blame, simply because of the fact that I can imagine some kind of a just society, just in human terms, which does or ends up on the same path. Perhaps it takes longer, perhaps it's easier to turn away if you're on that path, some kind of, say, socialist society that ends up in the same mess. The thing that is missing from from really all the isms that we have in our world today, the main isms, is this our relationship with the rest of nature. And we separate ourselves from the animals, not just in the way we speak, but the things we assume about them. Research, I think, I'll let the biologist on the panel comment on this further. I'm not a biologist, but I think research shows that the lines we have drawn between ourselves and the animals are really quite blurry. Animals have language. Recently, people have started deciphering the communication system of white-handed gibbons. So I think that, to me, the ultimate question is this, that can we remove the delusion of our separation from nature in time and look for something or some things entirely new other than the old isms that have not served us, because they all have this in common, that they separate us from the rest of nature.
I think we maybe have the Abrahamic religions to blame for that. You were saying how capitalism isn't the only problem in terms of defining what we're thinking about, and I think that's the major source of our wanting to draw a strong division between us and the rest of the species on the planet.
Well, I agree with that sort of, with the ontological line there, that like obviously, if you're coming out of Genesis, you have a very strong sense that man is different from animal, and humans are different from animals. But it's not just, these sorts of environmental problems are not just things that we run into in Western culture and Western history. There's a wonderful book called Retreat with the Elephants that I'm forgetting the author's name, but it's an environmental history of domestic China, specifically the gradual extinction of the Chinese elephant and massive deforestation and environmental degradation and devastation that occurred throughout the Song Dynasty, which is, and the point here being that a lot of the texts that come down to us from poets and philosophers who are contemporary with this devastation that are talking about the value of nature and the value of human relationships with nature are written in reaction to a societal situation that is massively destructive and is causing a lot of devastation that we can't cover from. That like we have these texts that we think are modeling a better societal relationship and actually protesting against a societal relationship that was deeply problematic. The dynamics of that problem may be different from the ones that we have, and certainly from longer.
Yeah, China isn't the only civilization that did it. The Romans did it. I mean, they expanded to the, I mean, if you read solar renewable energy history, of course, some of the primary solar energy was wood, and the Romans gobbled it up until there wasn't any left. And then they went out and conquered people and gobbled up their wood. I mean, it's what Vandana was saying, just 2 points. It raises the issue of the tension between science and culture. You take capitalism as a culture, or the Chinese as a culture, any culture at the time, there are always people, if you look at literature in the past, who recognized that imbalance with the relationship with nature. Writers of the past, Roman writers, you can find some saying, you know, hey, we're knocking all the trees down, that's not a good idea, blah, blah. And off they got rolled over by their culture that went along its path of conquest until it ran into the limit that they couldn't ignore it anymore. It isn't a capitalistic problem. We have a very efficient system of doing it, unfortunately. But even that, though, raises, still, if we're focused on climate change as the issue, 100 years ago, our culture, even our science, didn't know what we were doing. And that raises that interesting problem of speculation, of assessing what we are doing to the world, and the perspective that science brings and allows us to even understand that we are affecting the world at that level. And that's where the politics comes in, because what are we living out in front of our very eyes is, I wrote an article 20 years ago for a little kids magazine about global warming, and I talked to a scientist who said, hey, I hate to tell you this, but the science is in and we're already over the edge because of the way of the latent effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this was 1995, that this guy, DOE scientist, was telling me, you know, before the DOE was told not to think about this anymore by certain political powers, they knew what was happening, and they knew we had about 20 years to turn it around. And if we didn't, the carbon cycle would play out regardless of what we did. You know, that was pretty heavy stuff for me to learn, and not something I passed along in the article for kids. That's a whole other issue about educating about this. But what do you do when the culture doesn't want the science? When enormously powerful forces don't want the science, which is hard enough to grasp in the first place, to actually come to help normal people understand what we're doing to our world. And I mean, I've lived in that tension a lot, both as in the real world, but also I like to explore it in my fiction. With the way I come at it is backwards. Like in both Space Station Rat and in the latest book, I come at it backwards, not by presenting the problem, but presenting that it's already happened and the world is now dealing with it. And in Space Station Rat particularly, we have global warming, New York is underwater, you know, all the buildings are up on stilts now, and the issue is technology is ready to solve the problem, solve it by bringing global cooling to work. So science is coming to save the day after science didn't save the day the first time. But the problem is, that's not going to be the answer, because the world is going into an ice age cycle, but science doesn't recognize that. So all these issues come into play, which are fascinating and difficult in our society to work out. I tend to think the tipping point has come toward the recognition of the climate change, but it's a battle, and it can be fought in fiction, and it can be fought in real world articles, real world work about that.
I like how often in publishing the first global climate change instinct is to flood New York.
I'm going to correct you just a little bit. So there was actually a Swedish chemist more than 100 years ago who laid out all of the groundwork for how climate change would work based on carbon dioxide emissions. So the science behind, if you put CO2 in the atmosphere, it's going to heat up the planet, has been around for a really long time. The part we couldn't predict was that our industrialization would explode exponentially as fast as it did. If you knew that we were going to industrialize as fast as we did, you could have predicted global climate change.
Yeah, I didn't mean that. I didn't know how fine we wanted to get, but yes, I mean, diesel recognize the problem. I mean, there have been, that's the issue, that just raises the issue better, which is that there are always kooks who had the right idea. But how does society know which kook to listen to until, what?
I'm really interested in
Now,
how
reading is not a coup. That if you're chemistry, you know that thing.
Yeah, that's quite true, actually. The way this has been discussed in the media and in the public is absolutely deplorable and, in fact, criminal, because there's absolutely no doubt about the basic science of climate change. We knew the mechanism by which, or at least we knew that carbon dioxide causes warming since about the 1850s and possibly beforehand. And in fact, the chemists who studied all that were interestingly studying it in the context of the possibility that carbon dioxide might be used to ward off, not all of them, one of them at least, ward off the next ice age. And ironically, that's what we are doing, without knowing what we're doing.
A little too fast, though.
And way too fast. And that's why this is so scary, is that when you up the rate of change to well beyond what's normal, a few thousand years or so perhaps, then there's all kinds of things that are going to spiral out of control, and what we call positive feedback loops, what's happening in the Arctic, for instance. So the bottom line is it's absolutely terrifying. We are living the apocalypse. But it's, there's a lot we don't know, in the sense that we don't know to what extent we can mitigate it. It's no longer accurate to say, or truthful to say, that we can stop climate change. Because, as you mentioned, there's so much CO2 already out there. It stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years. And we are removing carbon dioxide sinks as well by land use changes. So now the issue is, do we want a world that is as hot as hell and basically unlivable, or do we want a world that is extremely difficult but perhaps we scrape by? Those are essentially the choices as I see them. And I really think that science fiction, this is an opportunity for science fiction and fantasy writers to realize our full revolutionary potential, because I don't think we've done so fully so far. I think we really need to examine what lies underneath our systems of thinking, our ways of being, we need to, this is, as well as, was it based on those examinations, various what-if scenarios, right? Like, what if we did this, what if we did that, and how could we get there?
I am loving in this context, your discussion earlier of organizations and sort of the tension between organizational action and human action. I think we're picking up this thread in a lot of different ways on the panel, right? Where we have individuals who are saying, like, no, we need to pay attention to this, or we need to take action. And many people being aware of the problem, that there are large systems in place that sort of depend for their continued growth and development on not changing, right? The organization wants to preserve itself. So we're in kind of an age, this is where the fantasy universe ends up a little bit, we're kind of in an age of tension between enormous immaterial and basically immortal organizations, human beings, who have a vested interest in sort of sticking around and being on a planet that's more or less livable. The system doesn't really care whether humans find the planet livable or not, so long as it continues to function. It's an organism. It's sort of a medical organism. I don't know if that makes any sense.
So immune systems like Earth systems,
I-
geological cycles, that sort of thing.
I mean sort of sort of systems of
Right.
social and organizational systems.
Right, right. That
Which-
is this what we are trying to change?
Exactly. They want to stick around and they don't really care. I mean, like as sort of organizational entities,
Right.
they don't really care how miserable the people who are involved in it actually are, so long as they get to persist.
Right. And talking of misery, there are 13 million people, just one piece of statistic among many. 13 million people on the coast of Bangladesh and India, the Delta region, who need to be moved away from there within 10 years. Because every year they have to rebuild their villages on higher and higher land as the sea comes in. So that's one statistic. But like, do the CEOs of fossil fuel companies care? I think we all know the answer to that.
So much of like a lot of consumer technology does a very good job of, if you're inside the bubble, sort of externalizing all of the costs of
Exactly.
maintaining the bubble. We're really good at that kind of waste management. It's like horrible.
So what is science fiction's revolutionary potential? I mean, I'm pretty skeptical about the five of us writing something that will change those systems that are in place. And like, I think...
Where's your ambition?
I have it, I just...
Wait a minute, it's been beaten down.
So I would love for you to, where should my ambition be?
Well, I think it's interesting because here we are talking mostly science, not fiction. And the bottom line in fiction is it's got to be a good story. I mean, there's quite clear examples of proselytizing writing, and it's usually not great. I mean, my first ambition is always to write a great story. And again, in all of my books, these threads are somewhat tangential. They're there, but that's because I care about these issues and we have to weave them into your work. But none of my books go straight at this issue. But another example from my life, on several levels I've dealt with it both personally and culturally. One, personally, I live in a house with one solar panel. That's all it takes. And I use 1/100th of the electricity that most people use. And I live fine. And you can. And millions of people in the world would be very much better off with one solar panel. And organizationally, I've been an activist all my life. But the thing is, and Vandana just gave us one of those yet more scary disaster things. People are being hurt by this already. I mean, our world has been hurt by it already. But those aren't necessarily the best motivators. This touches on another panel that's in the conference about the new, quote, solar punk. It's a vision of those things that I would say story would bring or fantasy would bring. It's a vision of a world in which either the problem is acute and it's dealt with, or the problem's avoided because of the culture that exists. It's a fascinating culture and it sidesteps the problem. And as an activist, most of my life was spent quite apart. The global issue, the global warming issue, was actually a big problem for promoting solar because it got all bound together with the issue. Well, if climate change isn't happening, then we don't need solar energy, right? No, wait a minute. We need solar energy because it's a much better way for humans to exist on the planet Earth. We don't pollute the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, there's social justice aspects, resource use aspects that all are bound up in the technology. And if you get focused on, and what's actually happened, I think, the co-opting of that issue by the big interests like coal, who are threatened by the acknowledgement of the issue is, yeah, you're threatening their livelihood, but hey, there's another livelihood to be created with an alternate technology, and it's going to make people just as rich as oil will. It might not make the same people rich, although they have a way of generally benefiting. So it's all of these interesting forces, and then I think, those are the materials of a really good story. I don't, you know, I write my particular version of it, but I think there's fodder there for a lot of different kinds of stories that don't beat you over the head with the issue, but give us a vision of humanity facing the problem.
So to get back a little more directly to the question, I would like to see more fiction that makes the idea of geoengineering exciting in the way that space exploration is really exciting. So I don't know if it's going to change the world, but I would love people's imaginations were as grabbed by geoengineering.
So I'm terrified by geoengineering.
Me too.
You have an argument for it?
And the sad
So
thing,
the thing, my thing with geoengineering is that we are already in a situation where we are unintentionally conducting this enormous scientific experiment with our own planet. So we're
let's
already doing
intentionally do
it.
it.
Yeah, why not intentionally do it?
Well, the thing with that is that, you know, if we're stupid enough to cause so much change unintentionally, think of the amount of damage we could cause
If we really thought about it.
intentionally, right? But in any case, I think you know, there are a lot of you know, my basic problem with a lot of all of this is that if technological solutions don't work unless they're informed by some kind of a paradigm that also involves social solutions. And if you know, and geoengineering is being pushed. If you've read a book by the Australian philosopher and academic Clive Hamilton, I think it's called, blanking out of the name. If I recall it later, I'll let you know. But the people who are pushing geoengineering are, of course, you know, big government labs and so on and so forth, but also primarily fossil fuel companies. So one cannot look at a new technology without looking at who's pushing it and why. And also, so, you know, I agree that it's an interesting thing to explore, but we have to be really careful. And, you know, all kinds of questions arise. If you put satellites in space that block the sun's energy, well, you know, that shadow is going to fall somewhere on Earth where they're not going to be able to do agriculture. Who's that going to be? Or if you have sulfate aerosols, which is the most popular idea, then, you know, some people are worried that it might cause stratospheric cloud nucleation and make the problem worse and actually warm the planet further. So, you know, in a sense, it's important, I think, to acknowledge that we really don't know everything, and that, you know, say, none of these geoengineering solutions I've talked about are going to solve ocean acidification. So ultimately, the bottom line is that we have to get off our fossil fuel addiction. And getting off an addiction is so hard, but it's also really important to do. And that's where the imagination comes in. So that's just my
One danger I see of the sort of typical science fiction and fantastical toolbox for addressing these sorts of issues is that we end up in post-apocalypse stories an awful lot. And the post-apocalypse story, you know, I love Mad Max as much as the next person for obvious reasons, possibly even a little bit more. But the post-apocalypse gets used as an opportunity to talk about how horrible human beings can be to one another all the time, and sort of especially in American post-apocalyptic fiction, in direct sort of contradiction to research and observation on people who experience actual apocalyptic level events. You know, you go to war zones, you go to places after severe earthquakes, and you watch people coming together and forming communities. You don't get like people shaving off all their heads, creating some crazy chrome-based religion and running around and crosses in 24 hours or whatever. But so the post-apocalyptic toolbox gets rolled out to write fiction about climate change, which I think gets us into this very dangerous moral fantasy that there's nothing that we can do.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of two things that are interesting, going back to the geoengineering. It's really sad for me. I'm a science fiction technology person. I'm a technology person. You know, I love machines, I love cars, I love robots, and all of that stuff. And so the tech fix is so tantalizing to me to just relax and say, you know, look, right around the corner, maybe, right? Nobody's thought of it yet. Is somebody in their garage has got the thing that's going to suck up CO2 and let us regulate it to exactly what the climate should be. And that vision captivates me a little bit. But the fact is, Vandana's illuminating the fact of the incredible complexity of this issue, not only as a scientific issue, because scientists don't agree about whether the sulfation will cause this problem or not. I mean, it needs to be explored and probably talked about too long to help us. But an interesting book, a place to look for kind of dealing with that level that's of complexity in fiction, coming to mind are like the Green Mars book, Red Mars books. I can't remember the author now. Right, where we take it away. You know, one of the best things to deal with a problem is to not deal with the real problem, but push it a little bit aside so we don't get too many hot button issues. And so what he does is he's doing geoengineering on Mars. But he's raising all of the same issues that we're going to be facing on Earth if we did geoengineering, which is who's going to get hurt? The Martians, which are actually Earthlings, but the early Martians, if I'm remembering the novel right, you know, they're up in arms because now it's going to turn green. We want it red, we want it dusty, we want it that way. Well, who is going to decide if we could regulate climate? Whose climate is it going to be? I mean, I just had my garden destroyed by rain, all the beautiful blossoms. I don't want it to rain today. I want it to rain later. And if we actually got that technology, those kind of issues would come up, is who gets to decide where the rains fall. And I don't think those are going to be answerable questions. Those are just going to be bigger iterations of the common human problem of how do we all live on this earth equitably, just, you know, socially just to each other. And so like the Green Mars book explores it very well, the tensions that you'd be facing if that technology actually existed. But also an older book comes to mind, Ecotopia, which explores, is actually a utopian thing, but it explores California succeeding from the Union. And of course, it's an older book now, but one of the big issues for them was changing their energy technology base in order to avoid all the nasty things that the current technology we have was doing to the world. So there are, and it's an extremely detailed, imaginative exploration of the issues, and I can recommend, you know, those. But the real problem as a writer for fiction, you come back and back and back again, is it's not easy to deal with these kind of issues in fiction and still write a good story. That's always a really hard challenge, I think, as authors.
So a couple questions then emerge, right? Like, what kind of stories don't work to do the work that we need to do? There's such a strong temptation. I know as somebody who spends a lot of time writing thriller plots, like have something where somebody can sprint through an airlock and push a button right before a counter gets to 0 and fix the problem, and that doesn't work. You want to be able to stab someone in the chest and have a big explosion and there are ravens everywhere and then suddenly blow up his face. That doesn't work for this. So like what kind of, I mean, I'd really like to hear like Gwendolyn or Vandana, like what kind of stories can we be telling that like work as cool stories?
So one of my favorite ways of addressing this is to talk about the sort of immediate solutions that we might be using that will cause other problems. So I'm thinking in particular of Paolo Baccalini and his